Greetings, people of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as always, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA. And sorry if I sound a bit congested. I'm, still trying to overcome a bad sinus infection. I had a little gunk in my throat there. Anyway, welcome back to what is becoming a four-part series on the history of the American West. I wanted this week's episode to be about the history of the American cowboy. However, my cousin by association, Dakota, who also hosts the podcast, was not able to make it. And she may be here next week for what was supposed to be a three-part series, but instead I'm making a four-part series about the history of the American West, and we will close with the history of the American cowboy. So stick around for that. Anyway, this week's episode I decided to make about one of the biggest events in the history of westward expansion, and that, of course, is the gold rush. More specifically, the California gold rush, because there was another gold rush that happened in this country in 1799, and of all places, North Carolina. However, before I can tell you that story, I must tell you what was happening in the United States during this time, which was the mid and late 1840s. In 1846, the United States and Mexico went to war. California was under the loose control of the Mexican government. And during this time, California's population consisted of about 6,500 Californios, which were Californians of Spanish or Mexican descent, 700 foreigners, primarily Americans, and 150,000 Native Americans, whose numbers had been cut in half since the arrival of the Spanish in 1769. The Californios lived on vast ranches that had been granted by the Mexican government. The fighting ceased on February the 2nd, 1848, when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, formally ending the war and handing the control of California to the United States. However, neither side knew that gold had been discovered less than a month before on California soil. On January 24th, 1848, a man named James W. Marshall, who was a carpenter originally from New Jersey, found flakes of gold in the American River at the base of the Sierra Nevada Mountains near Coloma, California. At the time, Marshall was working to build a water-powered sawmill owned by a German-Swiss citizen named John Sutter, who had founded a colony of Nuevo Helvetia, New Switzerland, which would later become the city of Sacramento. And as Marshall later recalled of his historic discovery, it made my heart thump, for I was certain it was gold, and gold it was. Marshall and Sutter tried to keep their discovery under wraps, but word got out, and by mid-March, at least one newspaper was reporting large quantities of gold were being turned up at Sutter's mill. People in the larger cities, however, were skeptic, to say the least. When the news of gold reached the city of San Francisco, it was met with disbelief. Then, a businessman named Sam Brannan marched through the town waving a vial of precious metal as proof, and so by mid-June, stores stood empty. Most of the male population of San Francisco had gone to the mines. The rest of California soon followed. And that summer, men like Antonio Franco Coronel of Los Angeles dug for gold alongside other Californios, Native Americans, and a few white Americans already in California. When military governor Colonel Richard B. Mason toured the gold fields, he wrote a report that contained many astounding facts. 2 miners on Weber Creek gathered $17,000 in gold in 7 days. 6 miners with 50 Native Americans took out 273 pounds of gold. Sales at Sam Brannan's merchandise store near the mines totaled $36,000 in May, June, and early July. And Mason sent his report and a tin of gold to Washington, a trip of many months. When the word of gold hit the newsstands, people began flocking to California like flies to a rib roast. News of the fortunes made in California spread worldwide, and some of the first migrants to arrive there were people from lands accessible by boat, such as Oregon, Hawaii, Mexico, Chile, Peru, and China. When news hit the East Coast, people again were initially skeptical. East Coast newspapers first published accounts of the gold rush in mid-summer 1848. However, editors downplayed the notion despite letters from California, like one letter in the September 14th issue of the Philadelphia North American that read, "Your streams have minnows, and ours are paved with gold." And it was not until President James K. Polk announced Colonel Mason's report in his December 5th, 1848 State of the Union address that Americans did become believers. President Polk wrote, "The accounts of abundance of gold are of such an extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief they were not corroborated by the authentic reports of officers in the public service." Then, as 1848 turned to 1849, California saw a major influx of people. And yes, this is where the term 49ers originates. By that year, the non-native population of California had grown to almost 100,000 people, and nearly two-thirds of whom were Americans. Upon arrival in California, immigrants learned, however, that mining was a very difficult job, to say the least. They moved rock, dug dirt, and waded in freezing streams. They lost fingernails, got sick, and many suffered malnutrition. Many also died of disease or by accident. Hiram Pierce, a miner from Troy, New York, conducted a funeral for a young man from Maine who died of gangrene after carelessly shooting himself in the leg. Despite the hard work, or maybe even because of it, the promise of gold drew more and more gold miners every year. Towns with names like Hangtown, Sucker Flat, and Murderer's Bar sprouted in every promising crevice of the Sierras. And within just a few years, the little port of San Francisco became a raucous frontier town with a lively economy, and California was named the 31st state in the Union. First gold in California had largely disappeared, even as miners continued to arrive. As I said, mining had always been difficult and dangerous labor, and striking it rich required good luck as much as skill and hard work. The average daily take for an independent miner working with his pick and shovel had by then sharply decreased from what it had been in 1848. And as the gold became more and more difficult to reach, the growing industrialization of mining drove more and more miners from independence into wage labor. And the new technique of hydraulic mining, developed in 1853, brought enormous profits but destroyed much of the region's landscape. And although gold mining had continued throughout the 1850s, it had reached its peak by 1852, when some $800 million was pulled from the ground. After that year, the total take declined gradually, leveling off to around 45 million per year by 1857. Settlement in California continued, however, and by the end of the decade, the state's population was 380,000. I'm sure that some of you out there are wondering, well, what impact did the gold rush have on the land of California? Well, new mining methods and the population boom in the wake of the California gold rush definitely altered the landscape, and the technique of hydraulic mining brought enormous profits but destroyed much of the region's landscape. Dams were built to supply water to mine sites in summer, altered the course of rivers from farmland, and sediment from mines clogged others, and ruined the crops. The logging industry of the area was born from the need to construct extensive canals and feed boilers at the mine, further consuming natural resources. In 1884, hydraulic mining was outlawed by a court order, and soon agriculture became the dominant industry in California, and it remains so today. While a few mines and gold rush towns remain, much of the heritage of that era is preserved at various historic sites like Bodie State Historic Site, which is a decaying ghost town, and at Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park, where Sutter's Mill once stood. Well, what have we learned today? Well, I think we've learned that man definitely has an impact on the landscape. People will often go to extreme lengths to find wealth. And sometimes it doesn't matter how bad the circumstances are, they will go to any length to find gold. However, that is not to say that all impacts of the California gold rush were negative. The famed Pony Express was created to send mail and packages from California to the Midwest within a 2-week period using ponies. Businessman and founder of the California Star newspaper, Samuel Brannan, created a delivery mail service called the California Star Express that connected California to Missouri. And California-based businesses were definitely not the only ones benefiting from the gold rush. Foreign producers and manufacturers found new markets for their products in the United States. Agricultural producers in Chile suddenly had new consumers for their fruit, and China started exporting significant amounts of sugar, and Norway saw California as opportunities to expand its naval shipping industry. The gold rush also had great effects on transportation. The great hoopla surrounding the gold rush led to new roads, bridges, ferries, wagons, and steamships being created to help prospectors reach California, which was fairly isolated at the time. And this accelerated development of transportation culminated in the building of an isthmus across the Panama Canal, which greatly quickened travel. And San Francisco saw its rapid modernization and economic development rewarded as it was chosen as the site for the new terminus for the first transatlantic railroad, which linked the East Coast with California through Omaha and revolutionized transport and commerce. And California became the hub of a new Pacific market, and as Frederick Ingalls wrote to his collaborator Karl Marx, the new economy and markets arising from the gold rush seemed to come out of nothing, and I cannot imagine they were fans. What have we learned today? Well, we've learned that sometimes money can drive a man to do crazy things, like moving to a new state, digging, and having to stick his feet in cold water and shake a pan around to see if he found gold in it. We also learned that business follows people, not the other way around. And I'm sorry to cut this short, folks, but like I said, I'm still overcoming a bad cold, or no, a really bad sinus infection, actually, not a bad cold. And so I'm afraid I'm gonna have to cut this short. And so thank you for listening. Goodbye and God bless.